All right, today's lesson is on economic systems. We talked in class about how different groups, different societies have to answer questions about how are we going to meet some very basic goals for ourselves and use the resources we have. And so communities, countries, regions have to make choices about how they're going to use their resources, and that's really what this chapter is about. How do we have a system in place to make resources get from place to place and things like that. So there's three questions that every society, no matter if they're the most primitive societies living out in the backwoods, or if they're advanced societies living in places like Los Angeles, New York City, or even Owatonna, have to answer some very basic questions. The first one is, what goods and services will be produced? We mentioned in class that everybody has certain resources. We have time, we have money, we have our education, we may have computers, we may have other things. How are we going to utilize those things, and what are we going to make? And you can think of it on a base level. How am I going to use my education, my smarts, my abilities, the resources I have to get a better education, a better job? Well, societies have to think about how are we going to have the resources that we have to provide food, water, clothing, roads, all the other things that our society needs. How are we going to meet those needs for our people? So what are we going to make? And then we have to decide, how are they going to be produced? We have all kinds of different methods at our disposal. You have different methods to get your homework done. You could type it, you could write it, you could speak it into a computer. And for larger societies and for businesses, we have to decide, how are things going to be made? Are they going to be made by hand? Are they going to be made by machine? Are they going to be made at a factory here in town? Are they going to be shipped overseas and made in a sweatshop? That's entirely up to the societies to have to answer those questions. And when we looked at those pictures in class about how, different people in different parts of the world may have more or less resources to make those choices with. Maybe people out in living in the desert don't have the choice of using a machine. Maybe everything does have to be made by hand. Whereas here in larger industrial countries, we can make those choices. Are we going to make things very efficiently and at low cost by machines or in sweatshops, or are we going to take our time and make them like a craftsman might, slowly, individually, one at a time? We have that choice that people in other parts of the world may not. And then lastly, who gets the stuff? How is it divided up? We've got all this stuff made. Now who gets it? Is it for us? Is it for everybody? Is it for only those who can afford it? Is it for, how do we decide those things? There's three main different systems, economic systems. And what an economic system is, like I mentioned, is just an organized way of answering those three questions, providing for the wants and needs of the people. And we'll go through a couple of those today. The first one is a traditional economy. The second would be a command economy. And the third one is a market economy. So let's look at the first two of those today, because the third one is a little bit more complicated. The first one is really pretty easy. Traditional economies are just base level economic activity. These are ones that are based on tradition and ones where roles are sort of determined by previous generations. What have we done in the past? If my father is a fisherman, I might end up being a fisherman or a carpenter or a hunter or whatever job I've sort of been born into. Some examples might be, we don't have as many of these around today, so you can look back on medieval Europe. People might become craftspeople because their parent was a craftsperson or something like that. You still see this a little bit in some tribes in certain parts of the world, whether they're hunting tribes in the Kalahari Desert in Africa, or people living in northern Canada, the Inuit people, who still hunt for furs and hunt seals and fish and do things in a much more traditional way. But as modern society encroaches into these regions, it gets harder and harder for these people to maintain purely traditional economies. There are some real pros to this depending on how you look at it. The first one is, what your role is. We don't have all this confusion like we have here. Well, what am I going to do with my life? Where should I go to school? You're born into it. If I'm going to be a hunter because my dad was a hunter or a fisherman or whatever. And generally, life is pretty predictable and pretty stable. You don't have many major disruptions. They don't have some of the worries that we have about our economy or this or that or the other thing. They tend to develop in a little bit of isolation, so life goes along pretty smoothly, and you don't have to worry too much about what's going to happen tomorrow, because it'll probably be the same as it's been for the last 100 years. On the downside, though, if you're one of those people who comes up with new ideas and can think of new ways to do things, you're probably not going to be very comfortable here, because this kind of system really discourages that. If it's based on tradition and you're not a traditionalist, you might find yourself being very frustrated and squashed under this kind of system, because the way they answer those questions of what's going to be made, how's it going to be made, and who gets what's going to be made are all pretty much decided. They're done the way that they have done in the past. And the other thing is that because you're not progressing much, you're not innovating, you're not coming up with new ideas, generally these people exist at a little bit lower standard of living than what we're used to. Now, that you can say maybe that's a good thing and maybe it's not a good thing, but in general, these are people who are living in housing that would be much lower than what we are generally used to in Western society. And in terms of consumer goods, they really don't have a whole lot of that. So we'd say it's a lower standard of living. Now the next one we look at is a command economy. And this is another one you don't see nearly as much in the world. You used to see it a lot more, but as our Western culture, our consumer culture spreads throughout the world, it gets harder and harder to have a purely command economy. Command economy is one where all the economic activity is pretty much planned out by the government, and individual people have very little influence. Some examples would be Cuba, North Korea, the former Soviet Union, and China to some extent still has quite a bit of government control as well. And there are some pros to this type of system. One of them is, in a command economy, if you have one group making all the decisions of what's going to be produced, how's it going to be produced, and who's going to be produced for, you can change direction really quickly. You can make the whole economy turn in a different direction, because the government can just say, we're going to focus all our energy on farming, or we're going to focus all our energy on production of steel, or we're going to focus a lot of our energy on production of military goods. So in the Soviet Union, if we look back to where they were back in the 1920s and 30s, Joseph Stalin put in a 5-year plan where he said, by this time in 5 years, we're going to have this many new factories and be producing this much steel and things like that. Russia moved from what had been a really agricultural country to a very industrial country in a very, very short period of time, simply because he went out and told people, you're not going to be farmers anymore, you're going to work in a factory. Some other pros with that, sort of like a traditional economy, there's not a lot of uncertainty as to who will do what. You sort of are given those roles fairly early in life. And since the government employs people, there's really very little unemployment. The government gives everyone a job, whether it's really needed or not. Sometimes you have people who had jobs that really were kind of unnecessary, but since the government wanted everybody to feel a part of the working process, they just gave them jobs. There are a lot of cons to this from our standpoint, coming from a more free system. One is that it's really not designed to meet the wants and needs of consumers. Consumers say, hey, we want more shampoo, we want more TVs, we want this, that, or the other thing. The government says, that's great, but that's not how we've decided that we're going to use the resources. So in countries like the Soviet Union was a good example, there's a big shortage of consumer goods. Things like soap, televisions, clothing was very utilitarian. It served a purpose. The government said, we'll make clothes, but they're not going to be fashionable. We'll make cars, but they're not going to be high performance cars. They're just going to be to get you from point A to point B. And things like soap and, like I mentioned, deodorant, not really high in the priority list, which deodorant really should be. And this is just an example. Joseph Stalin's 5-year plan took money away from, consumer goods and pushed it into other things. The other thing is it provides strange incentives, and what I mean by that is your incentive is to maybe meet government quotas rather than produce anything that's necessarily of high quality. Like, for example, the government might say you're going to produce this many tons of electric motors. Well, this was a case in one of the factories in Russia, and rather than making more motors, they just made the world's heaviest motors just by adding more weight to them. So sometimes people will figure out how to get around the system. And like I said, it's not necessarily in the best way possible. People do just enough to meet those quotas. Last thing, some more cons. There's really not a whole lot of rewards for individual performance in this type of economy. If you are one of these people who can come up with new ideas, again, and you would be an entrepreneur in our type of economic system, someone who comes up with new ideas and is rewarded by making money off those things, you don't really have a chance to stand out in this type of economy, because the government will say, hey, that's a great idea, glad you came up with it, now it's ours, and you get nothing for it. And I put Tetris on there was because this was come up with by a Russian entrepreneur, but the government just took the idea and it ended up becoming an idea that came over here, and someone made money off it in the United States, but that person never did. It hasn't really no flexibility to handle problems. When things come up, like for example the Great Depression in the 1930s, Russia had a plan in place, a 5-year plan that didn't involve any problems. It planned on going very smoothly, and if there is a problem, all of a sudden there's really nothing in place to handle that. It's like if you were to say, I'm going to go through school and I'm going to get only A's and I'm going to graduate with a 4.0 GPA and go to this school, well, guess what? Then you get sick and maybe you fall behind a quarter and you have nothing in place, and you just say, well, my whole plan is ruined. I have nowhere to go from here. There's really not a whole lot of flexibility for it to handle changes. And the other thing is, it takes a lot of people to make all these decisions. If the government's going to decide how much grain is going to be produced and how much steel is going to be produced and how many tanks are going to be produced and how many people get new shirts or anything like that, where people are going to live, there has to be decision-making bodies for all those things, and that takes a lot of government decision makers, huge departments. And trying to get any changes through that chain of command is often very difficult. So there's a lot of different problems associated with this type of system. Next time, we'll pick it up and look at a market economy, and for now, we'll leave it off, and you have a short reading about the command economic system in Cuba.